This video is a follow-up to my most recent video, which explains mythological masculinity. And in this one, I wanted to specifically discuss Erich Neumann's writings on this topic. So in The Origins and History of Consciousness, Erich Neumann describes the connection between masculinity as it manifests in humans and mythology. And this is because the mythological ideas of like heaven, of spiritual idealization, of the heroic individual, all of these ideas work to catalyze the split between consciousness and the unconscious. And this was especially the case in the past. You do see how mythology specifically causes the ego to form within the psyche. But on this, he writes, "The birth of the hero and his fight with the dragon only become intelligible if the significance of masculinity has been understood. Only with the hero myth does the ego really come into its own as the bearer of masculinity." So we can see here that the hero's myth, which is really ubiquitous, is actually a template for adopting masculinity and becoming an independent individual. The ego begins to bear masculinity when it is able to proceed through the psychological stages of the hero's myth. And so becoming a man does entail embracing the mythological side of life. Now, key to this is the idea that mythology involves the kind of unseen realm of heaven, i.e. that which is opposed to nature or the natural world, because it's like a higher world that we strive to emulate. And so the natural world is often described in all of this, in the depth psychological language, as feminine. And this is because mythology refers to imagined idealizations. Like the idea of the great hero is just an idea which exists in the realm of psychological creations. And yet to be a man means somehow reaching into this mythological concept and using it as a template on which to base your own behavior. Now, before I elaborate further, this might raise some questions amongst the more inquisitive amongst you. About women and mythological women who can be idealizations of femininity rather than masculinity. So why are we saying that masculinity is inherently mythological? Well, it's important to realize that the distinction between feminine nature and masculine mythology shouldn't be regarded as absolute. Like we said previously, masculinity is not entirely mythological, and femininity shouldn't be seen as entirely natural, because we can observe a kind of spiritualization of femininity and feminine principles, whereby you have like a kind of mythological conception of what it means to be a woman. And so this polarity, which you'll see in the book and which you'll see described, being used to describe the dynamics of the psyche, is really more to highlight that the development of the ego involves a specific dynamic between the masculine animus in the psyche and the feminine anima, and how they pull against each other and how they fulfill different functions. And so the idea of spirituality being oriented towards the feminine is more to kind of highlight this dynamic and describe how nature is more oriented towards the feminine. And this is done for archetypal and symbolic reasons. So this means that developing one's masculinity doesn't only concern men. It also concerns women, especially these days when women are being called not to just fulfill, a motherly role or a feminine role, but also to have careers and fulfill a more masculine role. And so women succeeding at this also depends on a kind of mythological alignment with a higher ideal. And this involves tapping into their own masculinity. And so this lecture isn't really just for men, and it doesn't only concerns men's masculinity, but also women's masculinity, which is an important part of their psyche and which shouldn't be disregarded. But even if a woman attempts to emulate a more feminine mythological figure like Aphrodite or the Mother Mary, this attempted alignment, involves a kind of masculine attempt, a heroic attempt to resist the nature from within, to resist your natural impulses and the way you're normally behaving, and instead model a higher ideal of femininity. So hopefully this clarifies why masculinity, even in women, is mythological. Now, before I continue with this lecture, I wanted to share some amazing news, which some of you might have heard, and that's that I've begun working as a psychotherapist. I'm still currently in training, but I am in the phase where I'm seeing clients. So if you're interested in doing therapy with me, feel free to send me an email and we can get set up. I'm going to provide my email address in the description below. And prices are negotiable. So if you're looking for something more affordable, I can definitely help you with that. I'd be really happy to interact with some of you guys. And if you think that we'd be a good fit and that I could help you with whatever challenges you're facing, I'd love the opportunity to be able to assist you. So if you're interested in that, please check out the description. But anyways, let's get back to this quote, which again is the birth of the hero and his fight with the dragon only become intelligible if the significance of masculinity has been understood. Only with the hero myth does the ego really come into its own as the bearer of masculinity. So from this, we can also observe that the fight with the dragon is an important step in the ego's own growing independence. And this fight is also symbolic for the psychological process of basically wrestling with your own unconscious mind, so that the higher principles that you have adopted or that you're attempting to adopt can guide your behavior rather than your impulses or your instincts. Now, this is a very important principle to adopt, for example, when conquering your anxiety, because you may have this ideal of being a confident person who can tolerate, anxiety-inducing situations with calmness and collectedness, but then you may feel anxious involuntarily in certain situations. Now, the way to beat your anxiety is really to allow your mythological conception to stand at the forefront of your mind and to let it guide you rather than your emotions. So this idealized version of who you could be, which is entirely hypothetical and entirely within the realm of imagination, it's your job to become this being and to put this being forth into the world so that it can really be manifested. And it involves forcing yourself to be like this spiritual ideal, even when it feels uncomfortable. So there's going to be a lot of resistance that drags you back. And you're going to feel this discomfort because you're going against your inherent nature. And whenever you act in a way that's contrary to your nature, you're going to feel resistance. If you continue to do that, if you continue to push against that resistance, doing this enables you to gradually become like this idealized version of yourself. Now, there's nothing actually out of the ordinary about any of this. This is actually a normal part of being a human being and growing up in a particular culture. Your culture has endowed you with certain moral principles and spiritual virtues that you try to emulate. As a kid, this occurs at first with some difficulty, but then over time, it becomes more natural until it becomes very much ingrained in the way that you're thinking and very much ingrained into your own unconscious mind. And then sometimes work needs to be done in order to uncover what those values are that you're implicitly following. Now, Neumann refers to these principles as being derived from heaven because they are not natural, because they are taught to us by culture and passed down from generation to generation. And so in this sense, they are metaphysical. They, in a sense, transcend the physical world. Wrong slide. Now, importantly, the adoption of these principles occurs by means of the father archetype, whereby the authority figures of the culture teach these principles to the younger generation, and they are obeyed because they are coming from an authority figure. Now, this is actually an additional reason why there's that connection between masculinity and heaven, because heaven is supposed to be something above you, something that kind of has authority over you, just as the father exerts his authority from above, like literally from above if he's taller than you. Neumann writes that the men are ranked with the fathers, with the elders, who are the bulwark of law and order, and hence with the world system, which we may call symbolically heaven, because it stands at the opposite pole to the feminine earth. The system embraces the whole sacrosanct and magical world order, down to the law and reality of the state. Heaven, in this sense, is not the abode of a deity or a celestial locality. It simply denotes the spiritual pneuma principle, which, in masculine cultures, gives birth not only to the patriarchal God, but to scientific philosophy as well. Now, this last point is very interesting because it shows how broad this theme actually is. Because much of what distinguishes us as humans derives from this principle of being mythological. Even science, which most people I think would think of as something being opposed to mythology, is itself something that we strive to do because we push ourselves to do it. Science isn't something that's encoded in our genes, and so in this sense, becoming a great scientist or doing science involves a kind of mythological interaction with the world, not an entirely natural interaction. And then the principles which we learn through science, or which we can derive from science, can be spiritualized, so to speak, and taught to subsequent generations. Now, Neumann further writes that the stages of separation of the world parents, which initiates the independence of the ego and consciousness by giving rise to the principle of opposites, is therefore also the stage of increasing masculinity. Ego consciousness stands in manly opposition to the feminine unconscious. This strengthening of consciousness is borne out by the laying down of taboos and of moral attitudes, which delimit the conscious from the unconscious by substituting knowing action for unwitting impulse. So we see here how the imposition of certain moral rules and spiritual principles upon children as they're growing up causes a separation in their minds between instinct and principle. And they slowly start to use these principles to guide their actions rather than just doing what their feelings tell them or what their instincts tell them. Now, this is crucial for the existence of the human race, especially at the level of psychological development that we're currently at, because we each need to abide by these principles in daily life. Otherwise, we revert to, an animalistic state of anarchy, which actually has and does happen in societies where order breaks down. And it's a terrible thing to witness when you see, a society of individuals just become this animalistic mass. Now, as we said in the last video, it isn't only our actual father figures who serve as our role models for us to emulate, but also our mythological heroes, who are idealizations who we can likewise strive to be. And unlike real people, they can possess traits which are mythological and seemingly beyond human capabilities. Again, these are idealizations, they're role models. And so our creative imagination can, fill these characters with all sorts of traits. And traits which are things that we can strive to attain, even though they may seem like super difficult. Now, I mean, this is obvious, right? Because, Spider-Man can do whatever a spider can. But emulating Spider-Man and becoming like Spider-Man doesn't necessarily mean, having all of his capabilities like Spidey sense and using web shooters. But rather it could involve attempting to be like a noble hero, trying to be like Peter Parker, who is, an idealization of righteousness in a way, of like the ideal hero, someone who selflessly helps others and who doesn't shy away from danger and, who actively confronts evil. Now, oops, did I do it again? Yep. Now, in the religious past, this principle was way more in effect. As we were way more serious about these mythological idealizations, we believe that they were actually real, for one thing. And so we took much greater steps to attempt to emulate them. Now, on this, Neumann writes, the immortal soul of the divine king Osiris becomes the immortal soul of each and every Egyptian, even as Christ the Savior becomes the Christ soul of every Christian, the self within us. In the same way, the function of the chief, which is to will and decide, becomes the model for all subsequent acts of free will in the ego of the individual. I'll just pause quickly because that refers again to the activity of the father archetype, and how that causes a split within the psyche. And the law-making function, originally attributed to God and later to the man or personality, has in modern man become his inner court of conscience. So you can see how these mythological beings really do influence our minds and cause us to become more mythological and in a roundabout way become more human. So we can either absorb the behavior of our actual role models in life, and we do, or the mythological role models that appear in our stories. And this this being really starts to become a part of our psyches, because it's at first just something that we imagine, but then as we begin to act like this being, it's as though this being is finding manifestation through our behavior. So really interesting and really metaphysical stuff going on here. But again, it's not very unusual, because this is how humans have been operating for thousands of years. Now, what's really key here is imitation. Imitation is an instrumental method by which higher spiritual principles are integrated into the psyche of the individual. And so seeing our role models and emulating their behavior through imitation is how we start to adopt these principles. And it's a very important way through which these principles are attained. Now, historically, mythological beings have been greatly influential in shaping the way humans behave, Jesus being a very clear example of that. Not to say that Jesus was, a myth, that he wasn't real. He was a historical figure, but then the story we tell about him becomes mythologized. It becomes a myth. It doesn't become exactly like history. It becomes like a myth. And it becomes religious in that way. And the fact that we can model our behavior on fictional characters means that we can also choose to envision our own personal idealization and strive to be like them. Sorry, somebody's getting so many fucking spam calls these days. Another method by which one becomes a higher man is actually ritual. And by partaking in a kind of mythological recreation, people can equip themselves with the traits of these idealizations. It's important to realize that ritual was a very important part of our religious past. It's still a very important part for many religious people, part of the lives of many religious people today. And it shouldn't be underestimated that ritual has a kind of mythologizing effect upon the psyche. Now, sometimes, it's actually funny, because sometimes such rituals literally involve playing the part of these mythological beings. So you actually start to act like them in like a play or in some kind of ritual act. And so it's really showing how the emulation of a mythological being endows a person with these higher characteristics. Now, rites of initiation, which used to be very common, and in some sense are still very common, in some places still very common, are used to demarcate the line between being a boy and being a man. And the initiation ritual acts as a way to signify the entrance into manhood. And this actually involves the entrance into a mythological mode of existence, whereby heavenly principles begin to guide one's actions. And so humanity has created many, ways for masculinity to be adopted in a mythological sense. But today's secular society, obviously this depends on where you come from, but today's secular society doesn't tend to do this, or it tends to do it, but not in a way that's really involves the kind of adoption of spiritual principles. Now, on this, Neumann writes, in the initiation rites, therefore, the young men are, as it were, swallowed up by the tutelary spirit of this masculine world, and are reborn as children of the spirit rather than of the mother. They are sons of heaven, not just sons of earth. This spiritual rebirth signifies the birth of the higher man, who, even on the primitive level, is associated with consciousness, the ego, and willpower. Hence, the fundamental correlation between heaven and masculinity. Therein lies the higher activity of conscious action, conscious knowledge, and conscious creation, as distinct from the blind forces of unconscious drive. Now, for similar reasons, for similar ritualistic purposes, we can see how the coronation ceremonies of kings and emperors tend to be very elaborate and involve a lot of mythological imagery. This is all to demarcate the king as a special being separate from the rest of humanity, as somebody really partaking in a kind of mythological role. And, that was a big theme of the last video. And it all suggests that the king or emperor or whoever, that he is playing a higher role, a higher mythological role. Because that is exactly what he is doing. He's playing a role. He's playing the role of a specific individual, of a king, of a leader. And by playing that role, playing the part of a king rather than actually being a king, he can exert his authority and, partake in all of the things which his role demands. And so it really is just playing the role of a higher man. And so this is a principle that everybody should adopt, not just kings. Everybody should realize that in a similar way, you can play the role of the higher man you wish to be. And I've emphasized in the last video how playing the part is really crucial for all of this. You can act like these higher mythological beings, and by doing so, you can transform yourself greatly. Now, it will feel uncomfortable because it involves acting in a manner that's contrary to your habitual nature, but to become a higher man depends upon this, upon playing the part, playing the role. Now, the truth is, and a lot of people don't seem to notice this, is that we are all playing a character in life. Most of us really just don't notice this fact. But once you notice it, you realize that you can choose to play a completely different character if you like. The people who notice this the best are actors. And they realize that they can kind of shift into different ego modes. And so once you realize this, you realize that you can adopt the characteristics of the person you want to be. Once you're aware that you're already playing a character, you realize that there's a great deal of flexibility in this fact. And so if you are struggling with masculinity or with pursuing your hero's journey, one thing you can do is to envision your higher self. Spend some time thinking about what your higher self would look like. What kinds of traits do you want to have? And how do you want other people to perceive you? And what kind of principles do you want to believe in? And so there really is an infinite well of potential when we speak about becoming a mythological being. Does this mean for you being a smarter person or a stronger person or somebody who's more humble, somebody who holds higher principles and follows them more nobly? Does it mean becoming a more daring person? Does it mean becoming a more charismatic person? You can choose what kind of higher ideal speaks to you, and then you can choose to emulate it. Now, you may be inspired by fiction, or you may be inspired by real people. There have been many great examples of mythological men who acted in a way that other people observed them and then also wish to emulate. So by acting the part, you can really manifest this higher being, this higher idealized version of yourself into reality. And so one exercise which might be helpful in this regard is to find somebody who inspires you and learn about some of the things they like to do, like their work ethic or what they do in their free time or what their relationships were like. And you can start to behave like this and start to adopt these characteristics. Again, you're going to encounter resistance whenever you try to do this. But by pushing through, you can really become your higher self. This is actually how truly great individuals come into being. They act the part of a great individual so that this act starts to become reality. It takes an act of heroism to attempt to emulate this being. And life will throw you many challenges that may compel you to choose the easy path and, for example, let your anxiety win. And, it's okay if you do slip up a few times. There's no expectation that on your first attempt at this, it succeeds fully. But to really become a great individual, you need to push yourself to do it and to keep getting back up whenever you feel that kind of slippage, whenever you feel like you aren't living up to your higher self or you act in a way that's, different from your idealized self. As long as you keep pushing, you can really do this for yourself. Now, Neumann again writes, the criterion of manliness is an undaunted will, the ready ability to defend the ego and consciousness should need arise, and to master one's unconscious impulses and childish fears. So hopefully that summarizes everything. And before I let you go, I wanted to mention that I was considering making a practical guide for putting what I've said in this video into practice. And I was thinking of making it about one particular goal. So you can let me know if you have any other ideas. But this is one that a lot of people have told me. And it's that they want to be a better speaker. They want to be more articulate. And so I noticed that a lot of people struggle with this, and a lot of people can benefit from being a better speaker, and speaking more compellingly and with more charisma. And so I wanted to apply the idea of mythological masculinity to this concept and show you how it is that you can actually practice becoming a better speaker by adopting the characteristics of a great speaker. So if that's an idea that people are down to hear or to watch a video about, please let me know, and I can make that my next video. Or if you have another idea of something specific, like some kind of specific character trait that you want to adopt, feel free to let me know, and I can make a video about that. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. Again, if you want to contact me, my email is down below where we can get set up for a therapy appointment. But yeah, I hope you have a great day, and may good luck always come your way.